Today we're going to talk about something a little different. Today we're going to talk about ice. Ice is very useful stuff. It's been used to preserve food, to keep people cool, and to soothe injuries for centuries. It's so useful, in fact, that people couldn't wait for the invention of the refrigerator, and that's what brings me to King's Cross. Here, by the canal, is an ice house. It's not that Britain doesn't get ice. The problem is that we don't get it for very long, and when we need it most, at the height of summer, we don't have any. Not a problem these days, but for most of history, they didn't have refrigeration. But people are ingenious. As far back as the Roman era, entrepreneurs would go up into the mountains at night, collect snow and ice, and store it underground before sunrise. In 1619, King James I built what was probably the first ice house in Britain at Greenwich. It was referred to as a snow well rather than an ice house. It was a circular structure lined with brick with a wooden roof. Soon other nobles were copying the idea, collecting water from their lakes and ponds in winter and storing it through the year. The king's ice house was primitive compared to what was being built in Europe, and touring nobility copied designs from France and Italy. So that was great if you were rich, but if you were an ordinary person, you'd just have to sweat. Enter Carlo Gatti. Gatti was born in Switzerland, but he emigrated to Paris with his father. At some point, we don't know exactly when, he came to London, settled in Holborn, and started running a stand selling coffee and wafers, with a side hustle selling roast chestnuts. Evidently he had a head for business, because soon he was running multiple stands around London. In 1849 he co-founded a cafe, again in Holborn, with fellow countryman and chocolatier Battista Bolla. Despite being a new business and having very little money, Gatti and Bolla had purchased a chocolate-making machine and managed to wangle their way into displaying a model of this at the Great Exhibition of 1851. Chocolate, the eating kind, was a rarity in London at that time. Gatti would go from strength to strength, opening more cafes, restaurants and shops. By the time of his death in 1871, he owned a large and diverse empire of establishments. As well as his many eateries and coffee houses, he'd also got into entertainment and the ice trade. Not bad for a poor boy from Switzerland. I find Gatti's story both interesting and inspiring, but for now I'd like to concentrate on that ice trade thing. By 1851, ice cream had begun to be sold on the streets of London, and Gatti and Bolla advertised coffee and ices. Gatti got into the ice trade quite early on, and it's believed that he had a license to harvest ice from the Regent's Canal, which runs from Little Venice to Limehouse, and was a major freight artery in the 19th century. As canals are still, unless there's a boat on them, they were prone to freezing up, which of course held up freight. No doubt Gatti was doing them a bit of a favour. We don't know exactly what happened to the ice after that. Possibly he stored it in the cellar at Holborn, or possibly he sold it straight on to one of the other ice merchants. Unfortunately, a lot of Gatti's history is not very well recorded. What we do know is that by 1860 he was advertising himself as an ice merchant, and he had a proper ice house in what was known as Islington or Battlebridge, but we would now call King's Cross. He would soon open others. If you'll permit me to step into the story, a couple of weekends ago the ice house at King's Cross was open to the public, courtesy of its custodians, the Canal Museum. They invited me over, as it happens. Anyway, according to the staff of the museum, they think the ice house was probably built around 1857. It sits next to the Regent's Canal, but by this time Gatti had started getting his ice from elsewhere. London's ice merchants had started importing from America and Norway. Canal ice was cheap, but it wasn't very clean. The germ theory of disease hadn't fully caught on, but people had been aware for centuries that bad water could make you ill. And no one wants an ice cream that smells like sewage. The lakes and fjords of America and Norway were known for their purity. Norway was closer to Britain, so its ice was cheaper, so it was more in demand. The ice traders were pining for the fjords. If you've seen Frozen, the opening scene gives you a pretty good idea of how ice harvesting went, albeit with a certain amount of artistic license. Harvesting was the term used, along with other agricultural terminology. There were ice farmers and ice growers. The lakes or fjords were known as ice fields. Many of the workers were farmhands who would otherwise have been idle in winter. But as with normal farming, a good harvest was dependent on the weather. Ideal conditions were an early frost followed by a steady winter to ensure thick ice. If winter came late, the ice might be too thin. Ditto if there was too much snow. Snow is a surprisingly effective insulator, and it slowed the ice from forming. If the ice was too thin, it wouldn't last through the British summer. You wanted massive blocks. The best kind of ice was hard and totally transparent, known as steel or crystal ice. When it was time to harvest, the agricultural metaphor continued. After the snow had been cleared away, the next stage was what they called ploughing. Horses would drive a bladed implement along the ice, scoring it into sections. The next stage was to use the massive 6-foot-long ice saws to cut along the lines and split it into blocks. Then they'd either haul it out with hooks or float it downstream. Either way, it had to reach a ship. Now, if you were lucky, you might be able to get a ship fairly close. If not, you could send small loads by sledge. If you had a large load, well, it was time for the ice railways. Despite the name, these were not actually railways, but a long and elaborate system of wooden chutes. I think it's a shame these things aren't better known, because it required some truly elaborate engineering to ensure that the blocks could get all the way from the field to the ship, without slowing to a halt or falling right off. The railway terminated at the ship, with the ice often being slid straight into the hold. Loading could take days, so much so that the water might freeze around the ship, necessitating a wait until milder weather. The ice would be packed in, insulated with sawdust. The very best ice ships were wooden. Again, it provided better insulation than iron, but timber was also more flexible, which was crucial in conditions where your ship might get iced in. While specially built wooden steamships weren't unknown, most of them were sail-powered. Steam began to overtake sail in the late 19th century, but there were still sailing vessels in use right up until the 1920s. This might simply have been because sail power was cheaper than steam. Oslo was the main port for the export of ice, but Gatties came from Kragerø. The journey was a hazardous one. The coast of Norway was treacherous, and the journey across the North Sea in winter put ships at risk from storms and high winds. Ice itself carried its own dangers. No matter how well insulated your ship was, some of the ice would melt. That meltwater had to be pumped out right away, because if it wasn't, the ice would be loosened and start slipping around. That could destabilize the ship. It wasn't unknown for ice ships to capsize in conditions that other ships would withstand with ease. It didn't help that ice ships were often kept in poor condition. Not all of the ice went to London. Much of it was imported at the northeast fishing ports, where the trawlermen would use it to keep their catch fresh. Some was distributed to other cities. But London was by far the biggest consumer, taking about 40% of the Britain-bound crop. That is, after the inevitable loss of about 5 to 10% en route. The final part of the journey offered different hazards. The Thames estuary was treacherous. It was shallow and full of mudbanks. An inexperienced captain could easily run aground here, and many did. There were several docks that could handle ice, but that for Gatty was offloaded at Limehouse. The ship was done and would return to Norway, preferably carrying coal or some other cargo. The whole journey took about 24 days, if you were lucky. But there was one last leg of the journey for the ice itself. It would be loaded onto barges and transported onto Battlebridge Basin, to Gatty's ice house. The house contained 2 wells, one probably built in 1857 and the other in 1863. Each well could hold up to 750 tons. They were 70 feet deep and 40 feet in diameter. What's currently accessible is a fraction of what existed in the 19th century. They were lined with brick, then lined with timber and roofed over. There was a timber floor as well to enable meltwater to drain away. Working there was no fun at all. Obviously it was freezing cold. The ice blocks were heavy, about 200 weight. And it was very dark down there. Naturally you didn't want too many lamps, so the workers would operate by candlelight. Blocks would often freeze together. Cutting them up again was a risky business. There was an incident at Gatti's Ice House in 1871 when a 2-ton block of ice fell on a workman, killing him. The ice would be loaded onto carts for onward sale. Customers for ice might include restaurants, ice cream makers, clubs, cold stores, fishmongers, hospitals, brewers, and even some of the wealthier residents. But the ice trade was a precarious one. A mild winter in Norway might mean that the traders couldn't keep up with demand. But a mild summer in Britain might mean an oversupply. These things were hard to predict. You never knew when an unexpected heatwave might cause a spike in demand. The traders tended to have the upper hand over the importers. They could basically set the price. If there was any problem at the port, a lack of a buyer or a strike or a lack of space at the quay, offloading might be delayed and would therefore reduce the amount of cargo to sell. No doubt you've already figured out the connection between such precarious trading conditions and such cheap ships. But the second half of the 19th century brought the first artificial ice factories. In 1870, the Shingleton Company in Blackfriars started producing ice. This was slow to catch on. Artificial ice was perceived as impure and chemical. The ice was cloudy compared to the good stuff from Norway, which didn't help, and it was produced in smaller blocks that didn't last as long. Customers reported that it wasn't as good as the natural ice, and chemists discovered that it was indeed prone to contamination. In fact, as late as 1910, the United Ice Company, of which Carlo Gatti's company was by then a part, was done for slander by the North Pole Ice Company for alleging that their ice was artificial. Ironically, both companies actually did produce artificial ice on the side. It was really the First World War that brought an end to the imported ice trade. Price wars had reduced the profit margins further and further, and the outbreak of war meant that journeys across the North Sea went from perilous to foolhardy. In 1916, the British government outlawed the importation of ice from Norway without special permission. Trade resumed after the war, but at a far lower level. London was importing a fraction of what it had 50 years earlier. A freakishly warm Norwegian winter in 1924 meant that for the first time no ice was imported to London at all. Improvements in ice-making technology, including the introduction of domestic refrigerators that decade, reduced demand still further. There would still be the occasional cargo of ice offloaded in Britain, but the trade as a major economic force was well and truly spent. The ice house at King's Cross had long since ceased to operate as such. Demand had fallen sufficiently by the early 20th century that it was converted into a horse and cart depot in 1904. Then it became a warehouse, and finally, in 1992, it reopened as the Canal Museum. It is, as I say, possible to explore the old ice wells on select days. Looking back with modern eyes, the ice trade seems a little surreal. An entire trade with its own infrastructure and economics that people got rich from, or went bankrupt from, or even died over, for something that we now take for granted. Nothing more than simple frozen water. Well, I do hope you enjoyed today's video. It was supposed to be just a look around the ice house, but I kind of went down a rabbit hole of research. As well as the Canal Museum and its staff, I consulted three books for this video. Ice Houses by Tim Buxbaum, Coffee and Ices, The Story of Carlo Gatti in London by Felicity Kinross, and Ice Blocks from Norway by Michael Freeman. I'd like as ever to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the ice saws to my ice plough. I'd also like to thank the Canal Museum for inviting me over. It's well worth a trip if you have an interest in the history of canals, the history of the ice trade, or just industrial history in general. And all that remains for me to say is that I hope to see you all again very soon. Cheerio.